Welcome to the Women in Vinyl podcast with Jen DiEugenio, founder of Women in Vinyl, and contributor Robin Raymond. This podcast facilitates conversations with those working in the vinyl record industry to educate, demystify, and diversify the vinyl community.
Thank you for joining us on episode 39 of the Women in Vinyl podcast. You just heard Child Actress with the new single, Beloved. For this and more, visit childactress.bandcamp.com. With Turntime's lessening and industry conferences like Music Biz and Making Vinyl coming up, we thought we'd recap the first parts of how your record gets made. Revisit the magic of recorded sound transcribed to a lacquer and the sorcery of electroplating, and you'll feel even more prepared to jump into the conversation. Thank you to everyone who donated and participated in our Women in Vinyl Women's History Month drive. We're excited for all that's to come this year. Now let's get started.
Let's get into it, man. Let's talk about vinyl mastering specific, and then maybe we can talk about like digital mastering a little bit. So, how do we get the music onto the surface that we're cutting? Do you have a nice answer for that? Because I never do. It's always kind of a...
It's always complicated, but
yeah.
Just to like quickly do a quick rundown of the whole vinyl process. Yeah, the very standard procedure anytime music gets released into vinyl is there are three major parts, and I'm sure Jen and Robin agrees, and we can add like little stages here and there, but it's mainly starting with cutting the vinyl master. It's usually the lacquer master, also known as acetate, but it's made of an aluminum disc coated with nitrocellulose lacquer. And you were going to say something, Robin?
I was just going to say like our favorite sandwich cookie.
Yes. and
they'll take ships when you're out there.
A fresh box of lacquer discs is just so nice to open. And it smells really nice too. It smells like, well, it is technically nail polish.
I was going to say gunpowder and nail polish. Yeah. You got some weird smells. I bet the candles in your house smell really weird, Jen.
And from there, how your music gets cut onto vinyl is it starts with that first stage, which is it doesn't start out as a vinyl disc first. Of course, it's different when you're doing lathe cuts because it is direct to the actual material, right? Yeah. But with the actual process of mass manufacturing LPs, it starts with the acetate or lacquer disc. And you have a heated stylus. And that heated stylus is attached to like a diaphragm that translates. There's like an actual transduction from the acoustic to the actual electronic energy where the vibrations make it into the hot stylus, and that heated stylus cuts the music on the actual nitrocellulose lacquer on the acetate disc. And there's actually a vacuum that sucks those chip that is cut away from the disc. Do you guys have a vacuum attached to your lathe cuts?
So far, our processes are identical. Like my stylus is heated as well, and it like the cutter head. They're kind of almost the same. You have like a dynamic feedback cutter head, and I have just a dynamic cutter head at this point. I can upgrade mine, which is in the future.
And you can.
And what does that mean for someone that doesn't know what that is?
Like the feedback one, and Jet, you might be able to speak a little bit more to what the feedback cutter head is, because that's
Are
a
you
little bit
talking
more
about the program versus preview?
No, that's like what the actual, like, you get feedback on like from your cutter head and from the lacquer. Like there's an actual like frequency feedback that the head actually like reads and changes. So you're able to cut different and like higher and lower frequencies because of your feedback cutter head than I'm able to, because mine's only a dynamic cutter head. Does that kind of make sense, Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I feel like that's like sometimes why with lathe cuts in general, there's a discrepancy in lo-fi and hi-fi and whatever, but there's also like limitations on what a lathe cut head is able to do compared to like a lacquer cutting head or a DMM head for sure. But yeah, I have a vacuum too, and it pulls off my chip too. So
Yeah, and it's very important that you want to keep your cutting surface clean as you cut the music from beginning to end.
Yeah.
A lot of things come into place before the music gets cut into the actual disc. You have to take into account certain sonic characteristics in the music that you have to account for before you cut into vinyl, because the vinyl format has a lot of quirks. And if you're going to be the vinyl cutter, you need to account for those quirks to make sure that your music plays nicely on the vinyl format. So stuff like sibilance, stereo imaging on your low end, and even the programming of your music from beginning all the way to the end is also going to determine the how your music's going to play back on vinyl. But we're going to go into detail later on that. So once we've cut the actual music on the lacquer disc, when you cut the master, you don't play it back, because you want to make sure that once you've cut the lacquer master, it's completely pristine and it's shipped overnight to the second stage of the vinyl production process, which is the electroplating. So once your actual lacquer master is cut, when it goes into the second stage, which is plating, that's where your master gets turned into a metal stamper. And from the metal stamper, it gets sent into pressing, where your stampers for side A and B gets attached into a press, and tons of heated pressure just presses your vinyl chip and flattens it, and it hugs all the nooks and crannies of your metal stamper, and that's how you come up with an LP. So that's how your music gets transferred into a vinyl record.
I mean, I think that's the craziest part about lathe cutting, is that you get to cut an A and a B. I have to cut an A and a B on the same record. So if my A is great, that's super. If my B side gets blown, then I gotta cut an A and a B. So
yeah, and with lathe cut, you cut real time too.
Oh really?
do you cut in faster or half speed?
No,
just real time. So
yeah,
like
real time.
you can't rush a lathe cutter.
No, you can't.
Lady.
I mean, please. I hope everybody underline bolds and highlights that in their brain pans. Please don't rush lathe cutters.
Just
We're nice humans.
Whichever vinyl direction you go for, vinyl in general is time consuming. So I remembered on our panel with Sound Girls, Karen from Gold Rush Printing was saying, if you're ever going to be releasing your music on vinyl, only announce that your release date when you've approved the test pressing.
I can't stress that enough.
Right.
Like, underline, bold that, please.
Yeah, underline and bold that from a pressing plant perspective. I mean, I feel like that's the one thing that has always been echoed on every single thing that we've ever done with any of these conversations on any platform. It's wait until you get it in your hands, because there's 1 million things that can go wrong. So
well, and I
that's
think we
just
should
vinyl.
talk about some of the things that can go wrong. But first, I wanted to ask you both, from a cutting perspective, if there are certain types of music that you find easier to cut than others.
oh yeah.
You kind of don't want to jinx it though, because there are times when the supposedly easy record suddenly has some weird anomalies on that record. And sometimes the music that is supposed to be scary and difficult actually cuts without a problem.
Anything that is like in mono makes my life easy. So I mean that's the one thing. Anything that is a little bit more down the middle is fantastic. I mean, I find anything that is mostly acoustic instruments, like not in the digital realm. Anything that's like bass, drums, and like a real bass guitar or a stand-up bass, something that
Agree.
exists in nature.
Because I mean, vinyl is an old format that
Yeah.
existed in the days where music is just all these instruments. It's like
Exactly.
that instrument like lends itself well to the vinyl format as opposed to like freaking EDM and
and that's exactly it. I mean, I want to make a t-shirt, and maybe this is my spin-off t-shirt, the Robin Raymond line that's all rants from the Women in Vinyl
buy
podcast. Computers make music for computers. You can't always make a computer file or something that's made in Ableton and Native Instruments and all of those MIDI worlds into a vinyl friendly format.
Yeah,
So
I
I
mean,
mean,
it's interesting because, like, from a pressing perspective, a lot of times when something is really quiet, for example, it's harder because you really want
Yes,
to get
that
rid
too.
of like all of that surface noise that people used to appreciate for vinyl, they no longer want. So
Yeah.
it's harder to press that type of thing. So that's why I was curious from your guys'
Yeah.
perspective.
And also the whole fact that we have this new generation of vinyl listeners, and even people who are like enjoying vinyl for the first time, they have to realize the fact of the matter is vinyl noise is part of appreciating the format. You
Right.
can't enjoy vinyl with the idea that you're gonna have like a pristine, quiet listening experience. Like it's inherent to the format. And like what Jen was saying, sometimes what you might think is like an easy record to cut, for example, it's a highly dynamic record, which makes it sounds great, but then on the very quiet sections you also have to take into account the surface noise on your LP. So you have to make sure that the vinyl itself, the material, and like the temperature that it's pressed, all of those things are suddenly more exposed. So
I mean, even the stylus heat and the humidity in
Yeah.
your room is going to affect
even the sound
how
of
quiet you
the,
can
the
get.
Vacuum.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so a lot of things start to become more exposed and naked on like very quiet records, dynamic records.
It's true.
And on the other end of the spectrum, like just expect if you're an electronic producer that electronic music is not gonna translate like 100% accurately when cutting into vinyl format.
Yeah.
Especially if it's like Skrillex or like hard hitting, incredibly compressed sound, and that is part of the music for many of these genres. But just
and
expect
bass in
that
180-degree stereo.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm just like,
Yeah.
why though? Like,
Yeah.
I get it to a point because like,
there are certain like when I say like anytime I don't want to jinx a vinyl project, because sometimes the easiest can be the hardest. On the other end of the coin, there's also those that are seemingly scary and difficult, but then just go off without a hitch
Yeah.
when you cut onto vinyl. I've been doing a lot of electronic music into vinyl recently, and the more that you do it, you just get used to the whole processing that
Yeah.
works best for that genre specifically. But yeah, vinyl is interesting that way, because no matter how experimental the music scene gets, it's like vinyl is here to stay. And in a
It's
way,
true.
it's like setting people's expectations that this is how music is going to sound on vinyl. And at the end of the day, it's like that's the reason why you appreciate the format in the first place. It's different, but it's a character.
well,
So-
and to ask kind of a technical question from my side to your side, Jet, like when you get something that has like sub bass in 180-degree pan, are you having that conversation with the artist? Because I know I'll modify it and then listen to it and then A/B it. And
Yeah.
those listening at home, A/B means you're going to check your digital source and then check your like modifications and like what your cut's going to sound like, so that you can compare them and see if it's like close, no cigar. Maybe we could pass this. Like at what point do you have that conversation? Because I'm like, yo, this does, in my opinion, I've had to change this so much that it doesn't sound anything like what I think you're trying to achieve. So this is what it might sound like if you want to go ahead with this. But
I like I have had that conversation, especially for it's mostly electronic producers too.
totally.
If you guys look up this amazing artist, his name is Hark Madley, and his music's been featured in the most recent Apple iPhone ad, which is really cool. But it's essentially like experimental electronic hard-hitting music, and I already knew that this is going to take me an entire day of doing test cuts and processing. I had to like let the artist know that this is what you're going to be expecting when your music's going to be on vinyl. It's not going to be the same as like listening to your music on digital platforms at all.
And I think to jump in there real quick too, I find that a lot. This happens a lot when people are approving their test pressings.
Yeah.
They'll say things to us like the levels here are not correct, or we're hearing something, that's wrong and it'll be audio things, and like that's not something that we can do anything about when we're pressing. Like
totally.
we're just making a copy.
The reality.
Yeah.
It's the reality of the format. And it's up to us to set expectations.
Yeah.
And luckily for me, since I'm not in a position where I have to worry about making X number of vinyl cuts on one day. It's very much, this is the project that I'm going to work on. I can schedule as much time as I need to make sure it sounds great. And plus we cut at half speed, so it also makes cutting electronic music much easier on our end. But yeah, it's like at that point I can spend the whole day just doing just adjusting and doing test cuts. I'm very much fortunate to be in that position, but it's also not fun to be just being obsessive unnecessarily. So it's that and setting expectations.
Did you find that you got more comfortable or more bold having those conversations as you like matured in the role, or like were you like, I can do everything like right from the get-go? Because I mean, right when I started, I was like, everything's no problem, it's fine, I'll figure it out. Meanwhile, I'm like, oh my god, what am I doing? And
no, seriously, but I think the more you mature into this role, the more you're like eager to just set the facts and establish expectations. And it helps when the client attends the session. Right. And especially when they're there, I love doing test cuts for them. And since we have like this abundant number of 7-inch discs from Apollo, like huge stack, I like cutting 7-inch discs, like a one-off on an acetate disc, so they can hear how it sounds. And many times they realize that, oh, okay, this is what happens when you don't adjust your settings. I had to like explain to my client that if we don't do these necessary adjustments to the low end and to the high frequency sibilants on your production, this is how your music's gonna sound. And it could cause some groove lifts and skips and distortions. Sometimes them seeing it for themselves, they realize that, okay, I totally understand the limitations of vinyl. And yeah,
and what do those terms mean for someone that's listening?
I think that's one of the questions. It's like, what are the things that you have to expect when you're putting your music onto the vinyl format? Like number one, and I'm sure you guys have covered this before, is sibilance.
No, this is the first time we're getting into any actual audio talk, buddy. Oh yeah, exactly.
No, but
I told you.
That's why you're here.
I was like, oh, good. Now we got credibility. Hooray!
Shut up. So sibilance is going to be the first thing that is going to be like a reality check for many artists and clients putting their music on vinyl. Let's go back to the example of like easy records to cut. You'd think that like a folk record or like an acoustic singer-songwriter album or a jazz album is gonna cut great on vinyl without problems. Just watch out for the sibilants on the lead vocal, man. Like we had to cut like a Diana Krall record, and just her sound in general with Al Schmidt's mix. There's a lot of like very upfront, intimate, high frequency that's it just like jumps out of the mix.
Yeah.
And that's gonna be problematic when you're cutting onto vinyl. Like the actual physical stylus, when you're using your turntable, can't physically keep up with the rapid modulation of the sibilant energy when it's cut into the vinyl groove. So the higher the frequency, the shorter the grooves. So the grooves are just more rapid and shorter. When the playback stylus on your turntable traces the grooves, it can't physically keep up with the sibilants. So what ends up happening is it sounds like distortion. It's essentially going to be distortion on your turntable. Your vinyl cutter most of the time relies on de-essing in order to tame that sibilance. If you know that your music's going to go into the vinyl format, it's good to have some sensitivity and awareness to just tame those sibilants, because at the end of the day, it's better to control the sibilants on the mix stage as opposed to the
Getting
vinyl
a poor
cutting
mastering
stage.
engineer to do it.
Yeah. And vinyl cutters have really purpose-built tools that do a great job with targeting the sibilants without affecting the rest of the master. And there's a lot of like digital plugins that also do a great job. I personally prefer using Isotope RX to just do a spectral repair and isolate that S rather than using a standard de-esser. That's my personal preference. Sometimes I go through the entire album just isolating those S one at a time rather than like using a de-esser. That for me is like the most transparent, man.
Here,
it's
and
better
here,
than
and
like
here,
an
and
outboard.
there,
Yeah.
and here, and here.
Yeah. It's like at this point, vinyl cutters already know when a sibilant is not gonna.
It's going to be problematic.
Yeah, it's gonna be problematic. So if you're gonna be the mixer or the artist and you're sending your music into vinyl cutting, be aware, but also don't let that like affect your creativity and your production process. Because there's a lot of people who think that, oh, I've read this about vinyl, I'm just gonna take care of it and call it a day. So how music is essentially cut onto the vinyl format. So the mono center information on your mix gets cut as a lateral movement by your cutting stylus. The stereo is vertical, the vertical movement of your cutting stylus. So when you're talking about your cutting stylus being vertical, it goes up and down, up and down. So if there is some out of phase effects on your mix, that's going to end up causing some severe groove lifts, which is going to be a reject when you're cutting vinyl masters. Whether it's cutting lacquer masters or lathe cuts, those low end out of phase is going to cause potential groove lifts. And by groove lift, I mean the cutting stylus is going to go up so high that the groove is going to be so thin. If the groove is less than 1 mil, it's going to be a reject, and it's going to cause the stylus to skip on your turntable.
Also, depending on how heavy your tone arm is weighted as well.
Yes,
if you don't have a weighted tone arm, that's going to kick out
yeah,
so quick. Doesn't matter what kind of any record you have. If you've got a phase problem like that, it's good night, Irene.
Yeah,
there's
so
nothing we can do.
yeah, you guys have to do a tech talk of just how to set up your turntable. But
Totally.
yeah, anyway, I digress.
Oh yeah, no, we're not even gonna just talk about it. We're gonna make a video, show, and or tell.
Yeah,
but mostly show.
So anyway, going back to these low end stereo imaging, how vinyl cutters take care of this phenomenon on the vinyl stage is two ways. The most transparent way of controlling that low end phase effects and thinning grooves is to apply a high pass filter.
Yep.
And sometimes a filter is all you need. 20 hertz, 30 hertz high pass filter is already going to control that excessive vertical movement in your cutting stylus. Sometimes it's not enough. And at that case, that's when your vinyl cutter uses a low frequency crossover, where the low end information gets turned into mono, And it's surprising because a lot of cutting facilities tend to overdo the low frequency crossover. So another term for that is EE or blend. So many different facilities use different terms. But yeah, it's essentially low frequency crossover and making your low end mono. Like 60 hertz mono all the way down below 60 hertz is going to be a lot already. But I know of cutting facilities that have their low frequency crossover all the way up to 200 hertz, even higher.
Oh, wow.
And that's, yeah, at that point, you as the musician needs to realize that your music's just going to be gone. It's going to
presence, yeah.
sound different and your music's going to be compromised. So keep that in mind when you know that your music's going to go on vinyl. At the end of the day, you also don't want to mono your mixed productions just because, oh, this is going to help my vinyl cutter. So don't let those things limit your creative process if you're a producer. But at the same time, if there's unnecessary out of phase effects that happen in the low end, just keep that to a minimum. But don't excessively mono your low end just because you think it's going to make the vinyl cutting better. At the end of the day, talk to your vinyl cutter. That's what basically the main advice that I give to any artist wanting to release their music on vinyl. It's better to communicate with the people involved in the production process as opposed to a broker.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys have discussed that yet, but in the vinyl business, sometimes you don't realize that you as an indie musician might be talking to a broker as opposed to the people that are part of the production process. There's some good and bad things to that. Like the advantage is you don't have to worry about anything. It's
Right.
like the broker's going to do everything for you. But at the end of the day, a lot of cutting corners can happen. And the middleman pretty much takes a lot of that funding.
Jet, can you expand on what a high pass filter means and what the frequencies you were talking about for the lay people that might be enjoying our in-depth? Did you see what I did there? Cutting talk today. Can you tell us about what crossovers mean and what a high pass and maybe what a low pass filter is?
Yeah. So high pass filter is just a type of EQ, equalizing, that is applied at the mastering stage to just control that excessive buildup in the low end. So when you're talking about high pass filter, it's basically an EQ that filters out or attenuates that energy in the low frequency. If you're talking about 6 dB per octave attenuation around 20 hertz, so it's basically a curve that takes out all the information
don't
beyond.
want.
Yeah, the stuff you don't want, so you attenuate that. For the low pass filter, it's actually on the top end.
Yeah,
So it's
that
like you're
confused me
passing the low frequency.
forever at the
Very
beginning, and I was
confusing, right?
like, I want a low pass filter for the top end and a high
it's
pass filter
confusing.
for the bottom. What? I
Yeah,
was
that's
like,
that's reality, people.
I mean, it's like those kind of curveballs that honestly, like I feel 100% certain saying those are some of the things that block people from trying to go any farther and trying to help themselves in that, because
It's confusing.
absolutely. And if you don't have a background in it, it's hard to like force your way through. And
Yeah.
being one of the
Like,
people that
one-
did that, I was like bamboozled
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah, like high pass, in a way, what's helped me is when you're using a high pass filter, you're passing the highs.
Yeah, you're letting all the
So-
high stuff go.
Yeah,
Like,
including the 50
pass-
hertz
pass
is
by.
considered part of the high. Yeah,
Pass by,
Yeah.
hi.
Mm.
And now we're
So-
letting the low stuff go by. It's fine.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
exactly. Going back to controlling the buildup on the low frequencies and taming the excessive vertical movement of your cutting stylus that causes your grooves to really thin out,
Yeah.
just applying a high pass filter can help
Yeah.
sometimes. But if it's too much, a vinyl cutter can even use a low frequency crossover. So when we're talking about crossover, it's a certain point in the frequency spectrum where you set a frequency point where a certain adjustment happens beyond that crossover point. So when we're talking about like low frequency crossover,
Yeah.
at around, let's say, 100 hertz crossover for low frequency,
Mhm.
beyond the 100 hertz and below, that's when the whole mono effect happens. So depending on the outboard processor that the vinyl cutter uses or a plugin, the severity of the mono effect can be adjusted.
Right.
So let's say for like an electronic Skrillex production, you will need like an excessive LFX low frequency crossover at around 200 hertz or something. It really depends.
Yeah.
But also it depends on the vinyl cutter's cutting lathe.
Style. Mhm.
Yeah, and the style too. Certain cutting lathes can handle all these anomalies better. So it really depends on the cutting lathe and the vinyl cutter. So as much as you can, avoid doing all those processing for unnecessary reasons, except for the fact that you think it's going to improve your vinyl cutting. If at the end of the day you're doing processing that's not in the service of the music at the end of the day, you'd much rather leave that to the experts. So communicate with the pressing plant, and if it's possible for you to be able to connect with the actual vinyl cutter, that would be great.
And
So
maybe
yeah,
Jet, you could talk about why something may be cut at 33 versus 45 and the sort of space that allows.
So 45 RPM, a lot of audiophile records are cut at 45 RPM just because essentially they do offer like a higher fidelity quality in terms of listening to music, just because essentially on 45 RPM there's a lot more real estate for music to get tracked. There's so much more groove space for musical content to be cut into. So there's a lot more clarity and detail that you get to experience when you're listening to 45 RPM music. One of the few caveats of 45 RPM though, as opposed to 33, is because 45 RPM records take up so much more space for your music, you don't get to put as much amount of music on a 45 as opposed to 33. So for example, for a 12-inch 33 RPM record, you can cut about 20 to 23, 25 minutes of music. 25 is pushing it.
Pushing
I
it,
won't
yeah.
recommend. Yeah, exactly. For us ladies here, we freak out when someone gives 25 minutes. But ideally 18 to 20 minutes for 33 RPM. When it's 45 RPM, you're thinking about less than 15 minutes of
Oh yeah.
music per side. It's different for lathe cuts, right, Robin?
I mean, no, not really.
It's the same.
Really not. I mean, 25 is even pushing it for me at 33, just like based on where I actually have to put my stylus down to start cutting to avoid like wow and flutter. And just as a little
Reminder.
a little reminder, yeah, wow and flutter we addressed on our vinyl 101.1.
Cool.
So you can go back and treat yourself to that if you'd like. But yeah, just because my records don't adhere to the RIAA curve, again, something we talked about in vinyl 101.1, it's my records are a little bit different. So, I mean, I've been able to get 25 and a half and like 26 on a 33 without a label.
And so
Because labels take up space, people.
Well,
they take up space.
And we
So.
were going to talk about lacquer versus DMM, and so that could be a good sort of lead in there as
Oh, see what you did there? I'm not the only pun queen, you guys. I'm not the only one. I'm not. But I will call attention to it every time. Yes, I will.
But maybe, I mean, one of the really interesting things that Jet and I did when I visited was we played a record that was cut to DMM versus cut to lacquer,
Totally.
and played it in the studio. And I think it was so interesting, and I wish we could play that record for everybody.
I know.
But
I'll ask permission. It's gonna be difficult reaching out to record labels for this one because it's a pretty big artist.
yeah, that was a pretty big one. But maybe you could talk about that.
I'm speaking in the perspective of an actual lacquer cutter as opposed to DMM. So, I mean, at that point, you'll also have to realize that I am pro lacquer cutting.
We
as
all are
opposed to
here.
DMM. Yeah, but yeah, just to give you guys a quick background on what me and Jen did. So there was a project that due to time constraints while we were doing our test cuts with the lacquer master, the label decided that just in case it won't make it on time, that they're going to have DMM cutting for the record as well. So we ended up with this very rare opportunity where we have both test pressings for the lacquer master and the other test pressing where it started with a DMM. And it's just a very eye-opening A/B listening comparison. So we just made sure that when we were recording the test pressings for both the lacquer master and the DMM, that everything is consistent. Like the only variable here is whether we're listening to the lacquer or the DMM. And the lacquer just had so much more depth and low end information as opposed to DMM just having a harshness to it. So that's where my opinion lies. The thing with DMM is for its direct metal mastering. I believe that's what it stands for, correct?
Yeah, you got it.
But it's actually your music. It's technically bypassing the first stage, which is cutting into your lacquer acetate masters and just cutting directly into the metal.
Yeah, copper plate.
And yeah, in a copper plate. And that alone, just the fact that the music is cut from different into different masters, it already lends itself to a different sound.
Yeah, there's no
And
give.
yeah,
There's no give to
I'm
it,
just
man.
I'm just much sonically. There's a reason why lacquer acetates have been around and is considered the standard. DMM is a newer technology. Well, not necessarily newer because it's been around for like 20 decades. I can't fully recall the accurate numbers, but
I think DMM got started in the in the 70s, and then it got
Oh,
like
really?
really, really, really popular in the
Mhm.
80s, especially in Germania with like Kraftwerk and all of the
Oh, that's so
electronic
cool.
new wave, that kind of sound.
Maybe it
Because
is program dependent too.
and
Maybe
that was
DMM might be program
and that was one
dependent.
of the things, and that's I feel like why the Krauts really, I mean, they're responsible for the VMS 70, like the lacquer cutting lathe as well. So I mean, all hail
Yeah.
the fatherland. But like
1970s.
yeah, I know that they did find a lot of success in that kind of new wave music because there was more of that high end, like
Yeah, it's
harsh
very
kind of
interesting.
frequency.
So just know that if you're as the musician consumer, your music's gonna respond differently, whether it's DMM masters or
Really.
lacquer masters. For our listening comparison at that time, me and Jen, we listened to a rock album, and rock just sang on lacquer masters.
Yeah, it was a really cool comparison. And what are some things, I'm sure people who are listening to this are probably nerdy enough that they've seen the grooves under a microscope, and you guys look at those all the time. So, what are some things, like, people may have heard the term kissing grooves? What are some of those things that you run into when you're cutting?
Well, kissing grooves is definitely one of them. And when you're talking about kissing grooves, it's when the grooves
It's not
just
as romantic as it sounds.
yeah, but it literally
really not.
kisses
Yeah.
on the scope. Just when it's lightly touching, it's fine. It's not gonna be a reject. But if it very much, I'm not sure if this is like supposed to be PG, but Doug always said, if your grooves fornicate, then that's a reject. So
I mean,
yeah.
it's the consent rule right there. Light touching is fine. Once one groove overtakes the other one, it's a reject. I'm
it's a
sorry,
reject.
you're not
Consent
allowed.
is-
Consent rule.
So that's one of the terminologies you would hear when talking about vinyl. I know I listed a couple of things here, and I'm sure there's more. But the whole talk about lead in and lockout grooves. The lead in is the space on your record where the actual grooves start. So the very outermost part of your vinyl disc, the lead in is where the grooves come in, and it takes about a few seconds before the actual music starts. So that's the lead in. And the lockout groove is when your music is finally done, and then the groove just keeps on cutting for a couple more seconds, and then until the very end, it very much closes the groove by locking itself and ending the groove to where it meets with a previously cut groove all the way inside the disc. I hope I
The only time
explained it.
overlapping is okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's the only time when grooves can
Only
overlap. But you also want to make sure that, well, vinyl cutters already have it set to their cutting lathes, but the lockout grooves have to be like not directly under the label, because if it is, it's gonna ruin your stylus. And I'm not sure if you'd have to worry about that with lathe cuts since you have more control over it, Robin.
I mean, the way that my cutter head is oriented, the driver, like the actual speaker driver, will run into the chuck if I'm like not on it. So I
That's
have to
cool.
make sure that I'm like, oh, it's time. There's some times where I'm in like a mega squat, like waiting to the
Oh,
last
damn.
second so I can lift that head up. But
Your vinyl cutter will need to make sure that your record has lockout grooves, or else your turntable will just go crazy in terms of where the tone arm is going to settle once your record is done playing.
yeah, I'll just run
So-
into the label and you'll get a
Yeah.
wake-up call. Hey Jet, I was just going to say, kissing grooves, I mean, we pass them most of the time, and like when we see them on test cuts and stuff, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but they just sound like a little subtle distortion sometimes. It's not always. And like, I mean, that's kind of like the pass fail right there. Like if you're
True.
getting an egregious sound, then that smooch is just too much and you're like, okay, bye. This is a recut.
Consent.
But so sometimes you can hear kissing grooves and sometimes you can't. I mean,
Yeah.
we like to walk that line. For
Now,
sure.
we did talk about a little bit catalog numbers and scribe
Yeah.
numbers on Vinyl 101, but you guys are actually putting that in when you're cutting.
I do enjoy that part. So
You have a
whether
stamp
it's there-
too, don't you?
Is there
Yeah, we
pressure,
do.
like handwriting?
So
yeah.
it's so funny because
Spelling.
but yeah,
Dude.
Oh
I'm
my
sure,
God.
I'm sure you guys covered the scribe number, catalog number on
Yeah.
the previous episodes, because you'd be surprised by how many times a client doesn't have a scribe number ready when they're ordering
Oh,
their
yeah.
their vinyl. And sometimes like they can't even decide that we have to leave our lacquer master without any scribe number, and sometimes we ask the plating facility to scribe it for us because they haven't decided. It's a string of alphanumeric characters that makes your masters unique throughout the production process. So that's a very crucial when you decide to release your music on vinyl. But besides the scribe number that we etch onto the actual disc, there are times when the client is feeling fancy and they want like an entire phrase or a logo to be on there. So when we cut the NERD Lemonade album, it's an entire phrase that we
No.
cut.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and it's
Pharrell,
fun.
you're a monster.
I know. We only allow a certain number of characters.
No kidding. I mean, and that is again where lacquer and DMM has a huge advantage over being a lathe cutter, because man,
Oh man, yeah, that's got to be hard for you.
I
Do
like.
you have like a heated scribe? Like
Oh, I have
to
it like no, it's a little like metal kind of pen thing that Kevin
use kind of
so
that, too.
benevolently gave it. Yeah, I think it's like a legit scribe thing that he gave me as like my lightsaber.
That's rough. Yeah.
Yeah,
'cause
I have like 50
for those-
copies of like a huge sentence. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my
Oh
god.
my god.
And
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah, for
there's
those
something-
for those who aren't familiar, the lathe cuts, the actual material is the vinyl material itself, so it's a harder material. The acetate we start off on a vinyl cutting facility is a much more malleable material, and it's easier for us to cut the scribe numbers and a phrase and a logo. Yeah, and we also have a stamp
yeah, a little
in
bakery
our
stamp.
studio where our bakery logo is stamped onto the disc too, so that's fun. But it took practice for us to figure out how to make sure that we can cut without ruining the grooves.
Yeah.
So yeah, that took some practice, but we figured it out.
Did you? I haven't ever seen a JG on a record. Like I've seen a bakery stamp on a record. Maybe I just haven't seen any of your handiwork. But
So it really depends, but there are times when we don't put our initials on the actual vinyl masters.
why?
I
buddy?
prefer putting it, but it really depends. It's something that we all agreed upon as a team of 4 in the studio. So there's 4
Really?
of us, 3 mastering engineers. And if it's like a big label where all of us are involved, it's like we just keep it as the bakery. There are times where it's my personal client and they prefer that my initial is there. So
Hell
a lot
yeah. I mean,
yeah, it's like-
cutting is a totally.
it is.
I mean, that's such an integral and such a personal relationship with that record. But as like a cutting person who collects records, like I love to be able to celebrate my fellow cutting people. And I mean, like, I love the bakery for sure. And I know that you probably had a hand in something, but I mean, I would love to collect the entire set of Jet Galindo mastered and cut records because I'm a fan. Love your work, you know? But like, same with Levi. Like, Levi messaged me and he was like, oh, dude, you got to get this record that I just did. It's amazing.
I guess
like,
it's
okay,
different for
no problem. Send me the link. I'll buy it yesterday.
Because I know that with Black Belt, it's Levi, unless there are other mastering engineers.
No, it's just him.
Like for bigger facilities like Metropolis,
Lab PG, Sterling.
Sterling.
I mean, even
and-
Sterling, but like Nino puts.
It really varies. It really
Yeah.
depends on engineer to engineer. Like Eric Boulanger, who's our head engineer,
Yeah.
he puts a V instead of like
Oh, yeah.
EB.
I mean, it's it's such sorcery. Like
Yeah, like
Kevin's
at the end of
got
the
a little
day-
KP that you can like barely see. I think it's
there
only because
are-
I've
Well,
seen it
it's
so
fun
many times.
too, like on Discogs when I'm looking at all of my unofficial Black Sabbaths and tracking down where all
Yeah.
of these came from in different countries.
Totally.
You can tell by that scribe too, like who
Yeah.
cut it, where they got their plates from, or whatever. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and like as somebody that just makes plastic records, like seeing mine on Discogs is pretty crazy too.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, guess
What did
who
someone
made that?
call it? A heavy slab?
Oh, heavy slab of vinyl. That was wicked. I
Yeah.
mean, oh man, that was the best part. It was just like, this is a heavy slab of vinyl, and then if it says some surface noise but sounds great overall, and I was like, it's a lathe cut, bro.
That-
But like, it's
It's
also
a lathe
record.
cut.
That should be the
Again,
next
so-
T-shirt. Hashtag heavy slab.
Oh yeah. Again, in the Robin Raymond offside. Women in Vinyl line of t-shirts that have
There
awkward
should be
sayings
an
on
Easter
them.
egg on the Women in Vinyl website where they just
man.
click on that and it takes them
Heavy
to an
slabs.
Italian news store. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
But yeah,
But-
like there are some records like La La Land, Star Trek where my initials are there. It's like it's just
because those are
it,
two
it
on my
really
list.
varies. Like sometimes it's PhD with Peter Hewitt Dutton, our other mastering engineer here. It
Yeah.
really varies, but the thing that's mostly there is going to be the bakery logo.
Yeah.
So-
No, that's rad. I mean, like family first for sure. But I have a just like a short technical question because you did drop a little hint towards the half speed master.
Mm.
So because we kind of talked about I cut in real time at real speed, can you talk about half speed mastering? I mean, I know that there's going to be a bunch of people that have records that say half speed masters done at Abbey Road. Can you talk about half speed master and like
Sure.
why it's awesome or why it's
So-
inappropriate for something?
So it's funny because there was one, I forgot which project it was, that just triggered us the decision to just cut everything half speed moving forward. It was definitely a sacrifice on our end to make that decision because you make more money by spending less time cutting, you know? But we've just decided it was just a very much night and day difference with cutting half speed versus like normal speed on our lathe.
Right.
There's many variables that are involved, but specifically for our setup, the half speed just sings. And one of the main things that really helped half speed sound amazing on our setup is when you're remember the whole RIA curve with cutting. So the whole, I'm not sure if you guys have discussed RIA curve before. It looks like
Briefly.
you guys have.
Yeah.
So when cutting lacquer masters, the lathe already has an RIA curve on it, which means the low end is significantly brought down with the highs really boosted up. But that's essentially how a lot more music gets cut into a vinyl disc.
Right.
And pretty much all turntables will have the reverse RIA curve just so the music plays back flat. The one thing about half speed cutting is when you're cutting at half speed, there's less stress on cutting the highs on the music. So with that in mind, there's less stress on the actual cutting stylus into cutting all that high frequency information.
Right.
And with that, we're able to just add some more amplitude, just level overall, and just make it a more powerful sounding record
Right.
when you're cutting at half speed. What some people are saying that when you're cutting at half speed, you compromise the low end just a bit just because you're cutting at half the octave. So you're pretty much losing all that like 20 hertz and below.
I mean, something's got to
for-
give in a physical format.
Exactly,
Like you
yeah.
can't have everything. It's not a buffet.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. For our case, the half speed, just the whole advantages of half speed outweighed the regular cutting for us. I mean, a lot of egos on the bakery too. So it's like, fuck it, we're gonna make less money because we
We're gonna
sound so
make
much
better
better that
records.
way.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole record business right there.
But
we don't care
there
about money.
are-
Let's just make it sound cool.
There are rare cases where and also that's the reason why our studio is just a bit pricier compared to like other facilities. But at the end of the day, it's like whether it's an independent artist or not, I try to like lead them to the right direction in terms of
Yeah.
like vinyl, even though we don't end up cutting many times just because it's expensive as fuck for indie artists. But we were willing to just go half speed for that reason because it sounds amazing. But there are cases where we cut regular speed, and there was one time that we had to cut one-offs. So it's not like lathe
Oh,
cuts, but
okay.
it's like one-off. So
yeah.
just 20 discs in general for
What?
the
That's
L-
bonkers.
yeah, it's like basketball players. It's not the Lakers, but the LA
But the other
Nets.
guys? The LeBrons? Is it the LeBrons?
I know. The management wanted to gift like the basketball players vinyl records
But
of an
lacquers.
unreleased music on vinyl, so they decided let's do lacquers. It's very different from one-offs, right? It's different from lathe cuts. Like if you're going to go that route, just go for lathe cuts as opposed
That
to like
is
lacquer.
Yeah,
Gross
we've had
discs.
people
That's the most
reach out to
excessive
ask
thing.
for
One-offs,
short runs of like
short runs.
for the like season ticket holders to get like the I don't do sports, but like the
I don't sport.
but like whatever songs and like hype stuff they do and have.
Oh,
yeah, they
man.
wanted to like cut that kind of stuff.
Give me that all day. Refer them to me. I will do it.
Dude,
I mean,
Robin, there's gotta be like a way to connect with somehow. I guess sports likes those one-offs, huh?
Oh, dude, I get
Send us
so many.
sports to Robin.
Yes, I used to work for the
You're
Olympic
such a
team. This
nerd.
should be built in. Come on, I sport. Come on. I mean, there's a whole bunch of like licensing things there. So I mean, I
True.
don't generally do anything like that. Before I warned everyone. But just one other question, kind of, Jet. How much analog outboard gear do you have? Like, do you prefer working in an analog outboard chain, or do you do everything like in the box and in a digital like plug-in stream? Does that make your workflow easier for cutting? Do you like an analog tube kind of feel?
You should
on
probably
some...
So-
explain what that is too.
Yeah, explain it.
So for many of our readers, you guys
Readers.
know at this point what analog readers.
They're not reading.
Listeners.
This is opposite of reading.
Oh God, sorry. So for us podcast listeners,
There you go.
you guys are probably know already what analog versus digital is. So back when we were at the mastering lab, we can cut directly from tape machine to the cutting lathe,
That's my
and
dream.
that was. Yeah,
That's
that
my
was
dream.
amazing because it's harder in a way because you have to make sure that you time you already know when the next song is going to come when it passes through the tape.
Oh, yeah.
It's like everything is so much more manual, and you cannot leave the cutting session when you're cutting on
I can't
tape.
do that already.
Yeah, and the fun thing was back at the lab was our cutting console also had like the line amps and also the EQ. So there are times when the mastering happens on the fly
Awesome.
when we're cutting straight from the tape machine. So many times it's 2 or 3 people on board when
Oh yeah.
so we master with our completely fully analog chain in the main room, but we have the same equalizer in the cutting room.
Okay.
So once, for example, Doug, my mentor back then, once he's set his mastering cue for each song, we have like a few seconds before each song to like recall the settings.
Run across.
So there's a lot of like
Hit the
choreography that happens. So
Yeah.
that was so fun. It's like it just makes the whole vinyl cutting process so much more organic.
Totally.
And when it's a fully analog session, you just know it's gonna sing on the vinyl format.
Yeah.
And you have to take into account the use of analog de-essers. So we had the Orban and the Maselec. Both were amazing. So in a way, that was the thing that I really loved about cutting completely analog. And at the bakery, we're not able to cut analog anymore just because, as I mentioned a while ago, there's a lot of things about our cutting lathe that works
It's automated
alongside.
now?
Yeah, like just MIDI triggers that
Right.
make a lot of things computer controlled,
bring-
so we can
Like
focus
bringing
on
your
a
head
lot.
back and stuff.
Yeah, and also like the echo and the band and the
Right.
lockout groove.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more focus on the actual sonics. So even though we don't cut analog anymore, it's still something that I really enjoy doing.
These machines have not changed, and there's been no
Yeah.
new iteration of them since sometimes the 50s, sometimes the 60s, depending on what model you have. I think like literally before the phono cut, my lathe was like the newest one on the block. I mean, Surrey made it in 2008, I think. So
yeah,
I mean, so it's like a new version, but it's still
definitely
on
one of the younger
old
ones.
principles. Yeah, but still the same kind of principles, right? So
And I remember you sent me a PDF of like something about the horns on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
yeah, that was like really cool because there's still a lot of discussion even with old technology.
constantly.
And yeah, there's still a lot of evolution, and even with a lot of R&D still happen in the vinyl world, which is great that we have the Making Vinyl conference, so we still get up to date on what is happening with physical formats out there.
It's one of the
So
reasons that I can't leave Facebook, that vinyl cutting engineer
know.
worldwide. I'm
That's-
just like,
that's fun,
this is
yeah.
nerdy and I am here for, I don't even know what words you just said, but I'm going to
Yeah.
totally read about them. Yeah, it's the best.
So that was our recap on mastering and the first step in how your music gets to vinyl. Now, on to electroplating.
So we are talking about stampers. Those are the doohickeys that get plastic smashed all over them. They are the thing that are the functional unit in record pressing. So Jen, take it away.
Well, we're going to talk about electroplating, and there's going to be some weird father-mother stamper family of metals situation happening.
Writing
So-
the genesis of record pressing.
Yeah. So, electroplating is basically the process that creates a metal coating on a solid substrate, which in this case is our lacquer, with an electric current. And from there, for all the technical words, because this is used for other things besides lacquers, I would say to consult Wikipedia. We're going to get nerdy on the record aspect, for sure.
Totally.
So basically, it's a method of creating a nickel-coated copy, which creates a master, which we'll get into in a minute, but you can use that as a stamper, or it will create a mother, and then creates multiple stamper babies, which go into the press to press records. Yeah, I mean, there's so many facets of this, but I think basically what they do is they take the lacquer. Once it arrives, they make sure it's clean of any dust or oil, and then they attach it to this thing that holds it so that, you know, your fingerprints aren't on it. And then they use a spray gun to spray a mist of silver until it's evenly coated. And then at this point, it can go into the bath where an electric current is moving through it. And all those little nickel pieces are going to get electrically charged. They're going to get excited and they're going to stick to it and create this metal base that gets to certain thicknesses. And at the thickness that you want it is when you can take it out of the bath.
Yeah. Because it's going to get smashed thousands of times. So you want it to be a certain thickness. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to stand up to the abuse that it is about to endure.
This is done in a couple stages. So the first, you know, like we mentioned, is building up the base layer. And then the second is thickening that plate. And that's done at a higher current. And then once this is finished, you're actually peeling away that one piece from the other. So what was the lacquer and then the metal piece. That then is your father. So that can be used as a stamper. In the audiophile community, this can be like the most amazing thing. Like it could be like the top quality. There's only one of them. Most of the time in my world, we never do that. The average person doesn't usually do that for their record because you have no reference point then. So, you know, most people will put it back in the bath to then put that back in the bath to then create the mother plate. And so it's like positive, negative, positive, negative. So if your stamper is what presses into the vinyl, that's the same as your father, and then the mother is the negative of that.
Yeah,
so you can actually play it.
Yeah, because you can't go back, because once you peel those two pieces apart, that lacquer is destroyed. So that's sometimes one of the arguments between lacquer and DMM, which we'll talk about a little bit further. But yeah, plating is destructive to lacquers. So you can say bye-bye to that super sweet, exclusive little perfect copy of your record once you decide to dunk it in a silvery bath.
Yeah, and some facilities do a mother capture, which is great because then if you find an issue with your test pressing, you can really figure out if it's a vinyl pressing flaw or if it is a metal flaw, which if there is an issue in the metal, like a nick or anything like that, you do have to go back to the lacquer cutting phase. If you did a 2-step, and then if you do a 3-step, then you can make a new mother. So to kind of rewind that back, the father makes the mother, and a father can make up to 10 mothers, and a mother can make up to 10 stampers. And a stamper is typically good for about 1,000 standard weight, or 140-ish gram.
Thank you.
Or 500, 180 gram. And different plants say different things, but as a general overall standard, that's sort of what I see. So 3-step is because you literally have those 3 steps. And then 2-step is where you are using your father as a stamper, and then your mother will make those stampers. So you don't have that third reference point. So yeah, I mean, for most bands that aren't doing huge runs, a 2-step is sufficient.
And that's one of the reasons that sometimes making records takes time.
Right, because there's so many plating facilities and so many plants trying to
use them.
Get things plated.
Yeah.
Plus some of those facilities do both. So
Yeah. I mean, and there's chemistry involved there too. So, you have to go to some sort of schooling to understand electroplating. I mean, I did find a little class that I could get some sort of chemical kit shipped to my house, and then I could make a bath to do electroplating, of watches and low level jewelry and stuff like that. And I was kind of like, interest is piqued, but because it would be really cool just as an experiment to see if I could plate my records just for funsies. But I mean, I don't know that I would trust myself with a bunch of chemicals in a garage situation. So grinding coffee beans is one thing, but electroplating might be a totally different situation.
Yeah, and I think in the confusion of things with how a record is made, this is one of the big ones. Even just the steps involved, 3-step, 2-step, all that. I mean, it's almost like one of those brain twisters like you were talking about in the Jet episode, how, thinking of high end and low end and how it was
Reversed. Totally.
It's almost the same thing here where you're thinking of positive, negative. It can just become very confusing.
Yeah. The one way that I like to think about stampers is with a chips reference, because I'm all about sponsorship. So Oreo, get at me, and now Frito-Lay, get at me, because like Lay's, stampers have ridges.
Oh, there you go.
That's the way that I like to remember that part. So if you can play it, it's not a stamper. That's the way that I like to remember that, because everything is food. So. All of our allegories are food related.
I know. It's perfect. So once your stampers are ready, then the backs are sanded down to eliminate any surface anomalies, small bumps or ridges, any imperfections are going to be transferred to your vinyl. So sometimes, for an example, you'll see it'll look like a scratch or something on the record once it's pressed, but actually it's like a water stain. Mm-hmm. So even something like that, just when it's being cleaned, can transfer to the record. So you want to make sure that those are clean, sanded, and check back to Ren's episode for all the QC things.
Yeah, because everything on a stamper is backwards.
Yeah.
And when I was working in the QA department for a hot minute, that was one of my jobs, was looking at the stampers to make sure they were impeccable. And reading catalog numbers backwards is a skill set sometimes, because you have to definitely compare it with your production note and be like, do we have the right side? Because they also, that's something that we might have missed out on too, is lacquers are cut in an A and a B. They're not cut on an A side and then flip it over and cut on the B side. Yeah, so you have to make 2 separate pieces for stampers, for lacquers, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to pair them up when they come from the plating company, when they come to the plant or whatever. You have to look and make sure that you have the right catalog number and the right side. Potentially there's been a revision or a recut, so you have to make sure that all of that information is correct. So not only just looking for dimples and water spots and dust, sand, fingerprints, all of the things.
And if you decide to change your catalog number, or you didn't know what it was when you placed your order and now you want it, or you want something in your dead wax that you didn't think about before, if it gets to this stage, it has to be done now on the metal. Yeah. So you have to write it backwards. Yeah. So Ray worked at in plating at a pressing facility, and they had the alphabet backwards, right where he was, so that you could easily reference how to scribe things, because it would, sometimes a major label will put something out, or an indie label will, and then they'll swap, someone will get rights to something else, so then they no longer want said number in the dead wax. So yeah, it's
oh man. Poor Ray. That would make you cross-eyed at the best of times.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be amazing if you could write backwards with your non-dominant hand, just as a default?
Oh my God. So when I was a kid, I did that for quite some time. I used to write backwards so that you could hold it up to a mirror. My mom's like, you're not dyslexic. I'm like,
Are you sure though? No, I'm just, you have to read everything in a mirror because I'm a spy already. I love it. So, and when you're sanding a stamper, you're sanding the backside.
right.
So, I mean, if anybody is, I mean, looking at something, which is ill-advised when you're listening to a podcast, but if you're trying to look at a stamper or lacquer, like, so lacquers are 14 inches. If we're talking about making a stamper for a 12-inch record, so they cut off and like that part is destroyed and folded over, kind of crimped. So, I mean, and they're really sharp. Like those edges are snatched. They will draw blood, no problem. But then you flip it over. So if you look at the like the groove side, and if you see any imperfections or anything, you're like, oh, okay. And then, I mean, before it goes on press, like I've seen press ops like give it some good action with some really high grit sandpaper to try and buff out some of the things that they see that might create some sort of a audible pop or something when it goes onto the press. So
Right.
yeah, we don't sand the groove side, just so everybody's clear.
Right.
Don't do that. Don't sand the ridges.
That would be very bad for QC.
Oh man, just first date. Dee, 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 dee. Don't worry, guys, I got this.
Oh my god.
All of our record people right now are cringing.
Right.
Just thinking about that. You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah, and then stamper weights are important, and so is forming of the stamper. We have to, you have to center it. Looking under a microscope, you find like that center point, and then that's how they punch the center hole out. And then the sides are formed to the type of machine that it's going on to. And I think sometimes a reference point of an off-center stamper is if you've ever put a needle on and you've seen like your needle sway, like that would be potentially from an off-center stamper.
But yeah, I mean, like, and that's the thing. So, I mean, even with plating, like they're not just making stampers. They've got to do all of the math. So again, science that goes into making sure that everything is going to line up when it goes onto whatever machine, whether it's a Halifax or a Fairchild or a Viral or like
Phoenix Alpha.
a Phoenix Alpha, like X, Y, Z. Because all of those variables are going to play into how that plastic gets smashed. So optimal playing environments sometimes are not encouraged by math. So I mean, that goes into like the trigonometry and the geometry of like cutting records and all that kind of stuff.
So a lot of times stampers are supplied to plants. Not a lot of record pressing plants have plating facilities in them. So, things can happen, stamper damage can happen in shipping. So, I mean, yeah, lots of variables.
Totally.
So we keep talking about DMM.
Yeah,
maybe we should get into it.
DMM.
Another one of our great debates.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not even like a debate as more as like it kind of shows on what side of the oceans that we're on. You know what I mean?
True.
Because there's definitely like there is an uptick in technology and like trying to advance the cause of cutting records and stuff when there was a change in music. And I mean, although everything sounds pretty good through lacquer, like DMM lends itself very well to all kinds of music. It's got just a different frequency response and like that kind of stuff. So I mean, German electro sounds really wicked in DMM, and that's
Right.
where they do a lot of it. So
Right.
that might be part of it. They just have harnessed the ability and like really understood the DMM capabilities and like that where it's the best, because there's only I think 8 or 10 VMS 80s in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them are in GZ in Czechoslovakia. Well, I mean, Czech Republic. Sorry. This isn't 1991 anymore. And there's like a few in California. Again, with the Scientologists.
Yes. And when I was rereading all of this too, I saw that there's one plating facility that has a special room for them where they just do their stuff.
They're L. Ron Hubbard records. I love it.
So that someday when a new civilization is here, they will think he is.
Oh, I mean, that's like we could do a whole episode on records and Scientology, and I think we should because that would be hilarious for me.
Then they'll start targeting us on Instagram again.
Perfect. Can I be best friends with Tom Cruise? Because that would be great. I mean, come on. I'm Tom. If you're listening, I feel the need for speed. Okay, like let's talk about Top Gun all day, no problem. I digress. Okay. So DMM is an alternative to lacquer cutting because you're cutting directly into a copper plate. So that kind of replaces the need for lacquer.
I think it's more of just people being able to have the choice
Yeah.
for their music, which is an important thing, I think. And some places don't really give you that choice.
I mean, it would be really cool if we figured out, and maybe I'm going to just trademark this before it happens. If there was a way to model like what it would sound like on lacquer and what it would sound like DMM.
Right. Totally. Because, well, get with Isotope.
Yeah. Hey, software engineers,
Right.
I'm right
Yeah.
here. I'll
They
help
did
you.
that- Yeah, they did that vinyl plugin.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that would be really cool because, you know, like Jet mentioned, the record that we listened to, it was a rock
That will
record.
remain nameless. Yep.
It will remain nameless. The comparison, the lacquer sounded so much better. But, you know, like you're saying, it makes total sense that other music would sound really great on DMM. So,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and it comes down to, you know, who's mastering it too, and if they have a lot of experience with DMM. And I mean, one of the sneaky, lesser known things about DMM too is that some of it goes through this process called visual vinyl mastering, and so it just goes through a program. And instead of having like an actual mastering engineer obsessing over what the groove looks like in the depth and, you know, spacing and everything, it goes through an algorithm and a computer cuts your record, which is good for fastness and whatever, but, you know, maybe doesn't optimize the medium as much as it could. So, I mean, that might be one of the bigger complaints. And I maybe not even complaints, but like feedback with DMM is that, you know, because it's kind of got, I mean, and this is an audio joke, hard limits on what is being enforced in that program. Like maybe there could be more highs here, or they could do something with the low end here or whatever to make it like sound better.
right.
But because it's, you know, they're going for speed, then it is not getting that care and attention that maybe it might need to be. And again, no shade.
Right. Yeah, I
shade.
mean, you know, like you said, it does speed up the process because you're cutting right into the copper, so you don't need a father plate or a reference.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it says that they can make endless stampers, which I don't know about that.
I would like to see a record, like a quantifiable how many times a thing has been plated, to tell me how many times, because I'm sure there's something, there's got to be some sort of a number
Right.
that, I mean, maybe there's a Zeppelin stamper hanging out
Right.
that was cut in DMM, but I doubt that.
So yeah, I mean, you were talking about frequencies, different kinds of music. Lacquers are thought to have a more warm, full sound.
Mhm.
I can say that with the various Black Sabbath records, I will say that I find that to be true. If I was doing like an A/B comparison, and then DMM are more bright,
Mhm.
so sharp sort of sounding.
Yeah, they definitely have that like a really aggressive top end. And
Yeah.
I mean, and that's one of the things, like if you listen to like Depeche Mode or anything with lots of keyboards and I mean, probably all of the Rammstein records, like all of that, like synth, like craft work, that kind of stuff. Like that's the stuff that you want, right? So, I mean, I kind of say like music with like acoustic instruments, and like acoustic not being not plugged in, but like guitars and like tangible instruments like that will sound really good in lacquer. And then anything that's like keyboard, synth, modular synths and like ambient stuff and like that kind of electronic music and electronically modeled MIDI, that stuff will sound pretty good on DMM. I mean, it'll sound great on lacquer too, but I mean, that's kind of that's my hot take
Yeah.
on that. And that's from like hours of listening to both in QA
Right.
too. So where like the plant that I worked at for a hot minute, most of our records were DMM. So it was funny to like work at a lacquer facility during my time and then be at a pressing plant where we were like majority DMM. So I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Were you doing it in-house, cutting and plating, or were you getting them?
No, our everything gets it was all cut at GZ and
Okay.
plated in Czech.
That's what I
and
thought.
then hopped over.
Do you think that we covered that confusing process?
I
well
mean,
enough?
it's all about dance steps, in my opinion. You know, there's a one step that's like, you know, it's the high school dance shuffle from one side to the other side. It like fits your purposes, gets it done. You know, there's no fancy dance moves, but you get your records pressed. I mean, that's like you're pressing like 1,000 records, 500 records. Then you have a two-step, which involves, you know, more pieces, ideally a partner. And then you have like more complicated dance moves that you can do. So then you have the addition of a mother, and you can make a bunch of stampers, or you can't. And then you have a father and a mother. And then you have a triple step. So then you have a mother, a father, and babies. And I mean, that's the way that I kind of look at it. I mean,
Yeah.
there was somebody that was explaining plating to me, and they were like, think of Genesis. And I was like the band? And they're like, no, like the part in the Bible. And I was like, why? And they're like, first you have the father, and then you get the mother out of the father. And I was like, oh, okay. So, I mean, for all of our theologians out there, like you can look at it at a bit like Adam's rib of
Right.
creating records. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for most small bands out there, you're gonna probably do a two-step. You should be fine for the amount of records that you're gonna press.
I mean, and like a two-step makes sense because then you're getting a copy of your master. Today, we talked about stampers, and that was super awesome. Thanks for joining us on the Women in Vinyl podcast. You can join our ever-growing list of sponsors. Other record labels: Selector, Couple Design, Eargasm, Groove Washer, Glowtronics, New Gen Audio, and Vinyl Revolution Record Show. And thanks for sponsoring the show. Hey, as always, you can join our conversation on Instagram or send us a note at media@womeninvinyl.com. Clock us, send us info. If you have a question, we got the answer, or we'll find it. We won't lie to you. And check out womeninvinyl.com for past episodes, the store, the job board, and the library of resources. Don't forget to like and subscribe and give us a review on your favorite podcast delivery method. You can also contribute to furthering our mission at patreon.com/womeninvinyl. Hey, guess what? This episode, 45 minutes. You know there was more. You want more? You get more. Go to patreon.com and you can get more. And you'll find all the B-sides, the deep cuts, and the amazing extras, including longer episodes, and contribute to the creation of scholarships and educational opportunities to further the demystification, the infiltration of more women and non-binary identifying humans into the vinyl making space. Decreasing those turnaround times every week. Yeah, we love your records. We want you to love them too. womeninvinyl.com.
This episode has been brought to you by Women in Vinyl and Red Spade Records. Thank you for listening. please remember to subscribe. And you can always contact us directly by visiting www.womeninvinyl.com.